welcome everyone for today's Lunch and Learn, the Tech Leadership Experiment. Thank you so much for joining us. I always think it's lovely when people are committed to professional development. So today I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land of which we meet today. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present. For those of you who are new to these Lunch and Learn sessions, I created this group because more often than not, people get promoted or moved into leadership roles because of the great work they do, and often it's with little or no training or support on how to become a manager or a leader within your area. So I feel like leadership sort of requires a different set of skills, and often at times it's basically an entirely different job to what you're used to. And so I found companies do sometimes have training programs and workshops, and it's a particular way of working that's worked for one person. But for me, I feel like leadership is a little bit personal. Some things that work for me don't work for others, and it's a work in progress. So things that worked for me 5 years ago don't necessarily work for me now. And that's why I've called it the leadership experiment. And it's because it is just an experiment and we keep going until we find what works. So if you're not already following our LinkedIn page, sorry, I'm just changing the slide.
Sorry, you want to go back to that first one? Yep.
No, the next one.
Oh, hang on.
It's all good. So for those of you who are, not following our LinkedIn page, it would be great if you could. We generally post new sessions, events, things up here, and it's a great place to meet other people who are going through their leadership journey. So I guess that would be a great thing. And so now to just introduce Simon. So today we're really lucky to have Simon Wood from Seedling Leadership volunteer his time for us. Now Simon's just as passionate as I am about supporting leaders in organisations, and I think that's what I really loved about him. As soon as I met him, he was very, very passionate about it. So for today's topic, he's going to be sharing some great insights and suggestions on how we can all do better when it comes to having difficult conversations, be it with teams, peers, managers. I feel like it is something that I personally get quite stressed out about. And when it happens, I'm like, this is completely fine. But up until then, I'm just like this big anxious ball of I don't know what. So I'm quite interested to see how the session goes as well personally. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you so much, Asmita, and thanks so much for inviting me to be part of your wonderful online webinars. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for people to come together, and you're absolutely right. I'm very passionate about this topic. I'm very passionate about leaders being able to find their best self, to be able to manage all these incredible challenges that are often in front of us when we have to enroll others, invite and inspire others to want to work together towards a common goal. Sounds easy, but very rarely do we have it all at our fingertips, and so we need some tools. We need some techniques that we can use to be able to initiate and have these great conversations. I'll leave it up to you to let people in through the lobby there, Asmita, if that's okay, and I'll crack on. So just a little bit about me, good people. My background is for the past 20 years, I've been working with leaders to help them be their very best self. I've got a background studying psychology, I've got coaching accreditations, and my business is a boutique consultancy based out of Melbourne. And we've got a network of associates that help businesses large and small around the country in realise their leadership ambition. Today is, as Meta referenced, one of my favourite topics. It's having the difficult conversation with your direct reports, with your peers, with colleagues, friends, with managers. And so in this very short amount of time, I'm going to fly through some ideas, and luckily it's recorded so we can go back, because yes, I do tend to speak quite quickly if I'm trying to get through stuff quickly. But we're going to fly through some ideas about, first of all, just recognizing why these conversations can be difficult. And then we're going to look at both mindset and skill. So let's discuss what's your intention. We're going to reference this idea of the neuroscience behind fight and flight, and using that knowledge, then what can we actually do to shift the dial in some of our key relationships? If we have to have a tough conversation, how do we frame it up? What are the things that we can say to create psychological safety? And then how do we deliver a message in the most effective way possible to be able to move that relationship in a positive way? One thing I will say is that when it comes to influencing skills, leadership, communication skills, there's no Jedi mind trick that wins 100% of the time. I think it's really important to reference that a lot of the time what we're doing is we're laying down the seeds of trust. We're nudging the conversations forward in a positive way. There will be circumstances where some of these tools and techniques won't work, and a more nuanced discussion would take place in one of our workshops if you were to come along. So let's just clarify our learning objectives today. The confidence to prepare for, conduct difficult conversations that elevate performance and strengthen relationships with anyone that's in your ecosystem. What I'm going to be really asking you to do is to think about how you pay attention to your intention and your mindset. What's going on up here before you start your conversations, while you're in your conversations, and then to pay direct attention to your language and your behavior. So let's get stuck straight into it. What's difficult about this? Why do we find these conversations so hard? Why do we attach the word courage to them? You know, when we think about these workplace relationships, why don't we just open up our mouth and just speak our truth? Surely we're all open to it. Well, of course, we worry. We worry about damaging the relationship with someone. If we raise an issue, is it going to leave some sort of long-term side effect on the relationship? We worry we might actually demotivate someone. You know, they get the message, but they leave feeling flat. Sometimes we doubt, do I have all the facts here? Maybe that will paralyze me with that absence of not knowing the full truth. Certainly, we would be naive to think that we don't worry about the political ramifications in a workplace, especially if we're speaking up the chain or to a significant stakeholder in our workplace. Well, hang on, who knows who? What might they say about us afterwards? Will that make things worse? Ultimately, it's all about worry. We worry, we worry, we worry. So let's really lean into that, okay? They're called courageous conversations because we do fear them. There can't be courage unless there is fear there. So that's an important point to make, because I want you to realize that at no stage, if there are things at stake, can we remove that worry. There's not a beta blocker that we can take. I mean, I suppose there is, but, you know, really, in absence of medication, you have to recognize that worry is part of it. So we lean into the worry and we say, okay, in order for me to manage the worry, I have to deploy courage. So let's be really clear about why we have to be courageous and step into some of these difficult issues. Yeah, because if we don't raise them, what's going to happen? Well, number one, here's the thing. Things don't magically get better. If there is an issue, maybe it's a relationship issue, maybe it's a trust issue, maybe it's someone's consistency, maybe it's the quality of their work, maybe it is about cultural emblems like values or gossip. They don't go away if they're left alone. I've never seen anyone, for instance, magically overcome incompetence through time alone. Something has to happen. So we need to recognize if we don't act, then that is as much our accountability as it is on the other person. Of course, not so good work, if left alone, we know that barrels into poorer outcomes for clients, for our team, for our sense of pride in what we're delivering. The third thing I'd say is that if we're in a culture whereby we're not raising issues, ultimately it erodes the culture and trust between us. We know that engagement is linked to trusting workplaces where there is psychological safety. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And ultimately all this leads to poor results. So we've got to lean into the idea that we have to create a case for ourselves. If I don't raise this, there are long-term consequences for me, for my team, for my clients, customers, for the organization. So we need to know, we need to act. This leads to something that I talk a lot about with leaders, and that is to say, well, in the midst of all the cut and thrust of work, the reactivity, it's really important you know what your values are. If you haven't paid attention to your values or done work on your values, then there's the old saying, someone that stands for nothing falls for anything. What do you stand for? What do you want to be known for as a leader? What are the values you want to live and lead by? And what do you want to role model in your organization? So if you do some of this work internally, first of all, it becomes a bit of a buttress, a bit of an energy source that gives you the confidence to say, well, I may not know what to do here, but by golly, I'm going to do something about it. So if we just sort of start off by building a set of kind of insights or tips, the first idea I want to cement is this. You must see the necessity in having the conversation. What happens if we don't have it? And can you live with that in the long run? If the answer to that is, I can't live with it in the long run, best take the conversation by the horns and have it today. As Susan Scott, the famous coach, says, tackle your toughest challenge today. And the second thing is, whether as a peer or as a leader, you are seen. So what are you role modeling to those around you? What is the culture that you would want to create? As Gandhi said, be the change that you want to see in the world. It starts with you. So there's some stuff around setting your intention, but I'm going to go a little bit further here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about your mindset when you're getting ready to have the conversation with someone. So if we think about the fact that we've already recognized we need some courage, we need to step into the breach, we need to actually do something or there'll be long-term consequences. How long do I get, how do I get my mind right? And I'm going to start off in a bit of an odd way, and I'm going to show you this diagram. Now, some of you will have seen this sort of thing straight away before, but what do you see first off? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? For some of you, you will have seen an aquatic animal, a duck. For others, you will have seen the rabbit. Now, why on earth would I be showing you wildlife at this particular point of the day? This is at the heart of conflict. This is at the heart of these so-called tough conversations. We very quickly look at a situation and we make our mind up. We are certain as to what is going on. We are certain that we know all the facts, all the perspectives, rather than actually recognizing that we are beings that are designed to make quick judgments, even if we don't have all the facts. We're designed to create facts where maybe it's just a point of view. And this is really important for your mindset as you're getting ready for a conversation, is that you start to say to yourself, okay, I might have a perspective here, but if I go in there trying to be right or trying to win, I'm creating a dichotomous dynamic. I'm creating a black and white win-lose dynamic. This is very dangerous, because if you're going to be right, that means that someone has to be wrong. If you're trying to win, that means someone else has to lose, which of course is going to create instantly a very hard gap to jump over. So as far as your mindset goes, don't try to be right. Just look for the right outcome. Don't try to win. Don't presume you own the whole truth. Someone else might see a duck where you see a rabbit. Now, that doesn't mean we don't share our perspective. Absolutely share it. Share it openly. Extend trust by sharing everything that you are feeling and seeing. But remember, you've both got the right to speak, because if you don't, what you're going to do is diminish the trust and the relationship between you and the other party. I hope that's resonating with you as I'm saying that. If you go in there with a certainty on a situation, expect someone to pick up on it and expect resistance. And this reminds me of a really powerful quote from Ron McMillan, the author of Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When the Stakes are High. Great book, ladies and gentlemen. I recommend it if you want to get your hands on it. And he says this: respect is like air. As long as it's present, nobody thinks about it. But if you take it away, it's all that people can think about. The instant people perceive disrespect in a conversation, the interaction is no longer about its original purpose. It's now about defending dignity. I really want to underline that with a big black pen here, right? The moment people perceive that there's something either disrespectful or that there is not the respect to hear their point of view, they're going to move to a place within the conversation about defending dignity. So we have to go in with an open mind. We have to go in there as strongly as we might feel about a situation, that there is a human being there that's got a whole other perspective and they deserve respect. And I tell you where this matters the most, when we feel like giving it the least. As I say, empathy is the easiest when we like someone. Where it really counts is when we're really struggling. And this is the core tenet of emotional intelligence. Many of you would be very familiar with the concept of emotional intelligence. In a nutshell, emotional intelligence is about understanding emotions, being able to manage them, either with yourself and others. So this is self-awareness, self-regulation. Do you know how you're showing up? Do you know what emotional state you're taking into a conversation? And are you getting yourself in the right state to have it? If you're coming in there flying hot off the handle, expect to get that blowback in the same way. We tend to fight fire with fire, will only make more fire. So we've got our self-awareness and our self-regulation, but also we've got to be bringing in our empathy, and we've got to bring in our relationship skills. And I'll be talking about some skills we can utilize here today. This is the core of what will make these conversations really successful. If you can balance these 4 areas of your intelligence set of emotional intelligence, you're going to have better outcomes. So today, before I get into some of the skills, I just want to remind you of a couple of things with regards to self-awareness and self-regulation. Ideally, we're having a conversation, and when we're having a conversation, it's a conscious, it's a very rational conversation. We all like to perceive ourselves as rational. Now, when you are relaxed, when you are having a great conversation with a friend, when you are talking about nothing that is too emotional, you will be using a part of the brain known as the prefrontal cortex. This is a little part of the brain that sits behind your forehead. We mainly a very developed part of the brain in humans. Monkeys have got a little bit of it, dolphins, dogs, but really humans have got a well-developed prefrontal cortex. And in order for this to be working, so that we can be deliberate, conscious, thoughtful, rational, we need a lot of blood in there. We need a lot of glucose and oxygen to put up with all the working that's required as we pay attention and think through things creatively. However, when we experience fight or flight, strong emotions, perhaps social threats, perhaps even physical threats, we know that we actually flip our brain usage. Blood flows out of the prefrontal cortex in a sort of sense and moves towards other parts of the brain, where we will move to a more reactive part of the brain. Some might say we're using the limbic system aided by the amygdala to really just respond quickly. This is very useful, obviously, in physical threat, where we can just move quickly, not overthink things. But of course, if I'm in a conversation with someone and I'm operating from this place, from a reactive place, well, I'm not going to be really moving forward in what I consider to be a rational way, am I? So I've got to recognize that if I want to get the best out of myself and the other party, I've got to get my brain right, and I have to communicate in a way that gets their brain right. Because if we're both operating from a place of high emotion and fear, we're not going to be using the most open-minded, considered and thoughtful mechanisms. So what can we do? Well, the first thing that we can do, good people, is we get ourselves right by utilizing deep breathing. Now, when I say deep breathing, I'm talking about something called the diaphragm. Now, in this image in front of you here, you can see a dark shaded area sitting at the base of lungs. If you were to stick your thumbs underneath your rib cage right now and press in a little bit and breathe in through your nose and expand your lungs down rather than expanding up through your chest, you're accessing your diaphragmatic breathing zone. Now, there's a technique known as box breath, where you breathe in for 3 or 4 counts through your nose. You hold for about 3 or 4 counts and then out through your mouth. Well, if you can do that a couple of times, here's what we know, and we've seen this under EEG, electroencephalographs. We've seen blood start to flow back into the prefrontal cortex. This is really important because If we can actually get ourselves right, we're going to be operating in a less reactive way. But funnily enough, when you are relaxed, you'll have an almost subconscious influence on the other person. You'll help them relax. If you're tense, they will tense. If you can breathe and relax your body and get your brain working right, it's going to have impact on the other party. Some other strategies that you can apply, I'm sure we've all heard of mindfulness. These are all really important. Identify what you're feeling, talk yourself through it, breathe, make a different choice. Just remember the emotion you're feeling is just that. It's an emotion and it skews our thinking. Sometimes a useful thing to do is reframe. What's another way of seeing this situation? What could be a valid reason for this person's behavior? If you can get that sort of thinking going, we know it activates more conscious brain states, which is what we want. So again, I'll come back to mindset. We don't want to own the truth. We don't want to be right. We want to share our perspective openly, but we want to also attribute positive intent. We want to show compassion and care, and that's only going to come from a place where you are breathing and where you are not reactive. So if I add to our ideas list here, all right, there will always be another point of view. If you ignore that, resistance will be high. So you've got to be open. There's a saying, hold strong opinions lightly. And this is a really important thing. I'm not going to say to you today to throw away your point of view, but you've got to be open to the fact that there'll be another point of view in the conversation. And the second idea, or the fourth really, is get your body under control. The body will be acting as if there is a tiger in the room. There will be nerves, there will be adrenaline, there will be blood wanting to go to your emergency systems. Breathe. You will think better with blood in the prefrontal cortex. And remember, the state that you are in will impact the other party. So we've spent a bit of time talking about our mindset and getting ourselves right. Let's start to look at some of the language. Let's start to look at some of the behavior that's going to help us nudge the conversations in the right direction. And so the first thing I want to talk to you about is this idea of psychological safety and the use of framing. So I'll talk to you about framing in a moment. So first of all, psychological safety, everyone's talking about it at the moment. Perhaps the thought leader globally on psychological safety is Professor Amy Edmondson out of Harvard, who talks about psychological safety as the confidence that candor and vulnerability are welcome. I love the way she expresses this. I think it's absolutely excellent. You're entering into a workplace, you're entering into a team space, you're entering into a conversation. Can you feel assured that you can be straightforward and honest and that you can be vulnerable? Now, vulnerable is one of these words that's being overused a lot. I think people are sometimes mistake vulnerable with weakness. In fact, quite the opposite. Vulnerability is the source of great strength. It is the vulnerability to be wrong, to change your mind and say, hey, I think you were right. The vulnerability to say, I'm struggling in this conversation. The vulnerability to say, I need help. If we can operate like that, we're going to have better conversations with people. Now, when you need to have a tough conversation, both candor and vulnerability will be under threat. Sometimes we don't say what we want to say. We're worried. We've talked about this earlier. We're worried about damaging the relationship, and we're worried about ramifications for ourselves. So we need to be able to somehow create the space in our mindset to think psychological safety for ourselves, yes, but to make it psychologically safe for the other person to be ready to have the conversation. And this is what framing will enable us to do. Framing is a way of starting a conversation so that people can make an assessment as to whether they're willing to conduct the conversation openly, honestly, with vulnerability. And let's talk a little bit about it. And the best metaphor that I can think of for framing is that if I'm asking you to take a risk, if I was to say to you, come walk up a mountain with me tomorrow, all right, everyone, come on, we're going to go walk out Mount Kosciuszko tomorrow. What would you need to know in order to say yes? Now, not everyone's an intrepid adventurer that's just ready to jump in the car and drive to the mountain range. Most of us, in order to do something risky, would need to know, well, why are we going? What will we see when we get there? What do I need to bring? What's the weather going to be like? What's the terrain like? Do you have a plan? What do I need to know? Human beings have leapt into the unknown through all of history, but they haven't done so willy-nilly. They've done so usually with a bit of forethought and a bit of a plan. They may not have explored distant lands, but they've thought about it. Well, guess what? A difficult conversation is the same. You want to provide people with information at the outset of a conversation that can make them feel as safe as they can so that they say, yes, I'm ready to hear your message. I really want you to embrace this idea that they've got a brain in there that will quickly go to fight or flight and thus a resistance point. And our job is to get that brain feeling ready, lucid, conscious, deliberate. So if we think with their brain in mind and we're thinking psychological safety, here are some things that we can say at the outset of a conversation to make someone feel like, okay, I'm ready to hear this right now. Now, these are some what we call framing tools. So position and topic, clear purpose, intention, self-disclosure, requests, and asking permission. So all of these can be used in different order. They can be mixed up. You can use them all, or you can just use one or two of them, but they're all very useful depending on how difficult the conversation is. So let me give you an example of what some of these things are. First of all, position and topic. This is where you signal the emotional tone of the conversation that's coming. Is it going to be challenging? Is it going to be ambiguous or tough? What's this about? I'll come back to why this is useful, but an example would be, look, I need to have a bit of a tough conversation with you. It's like telling someone what the weather's going to be like on the mountain. If an adult can hear that and know that it's straightforward, they're going to ready themselves for hearing the conversation. Certainly one of the things that we need to get really good at, which many people struggle with, is being succinct about the purpose of a conversation. Providing clarity is one of the best trust builders you can find, getting right to the heart of the matter rather than tiptoeing around, saying things like, can we just have a bit of a chat? How are things going with you at the moment? And we do this kind of indirect invitation into a conversation. It never works. People get a bit cagey, they get a bit suspicious. Don't start moving chess pieces around a chessboard. Go right to the heart of the matter. It builds trust. Perhaps one of the most important things that you can do is to declare openly your intention. What do you want the impact of this conversation to be on the other party? How do you want them to experience this conversation? What do you want it to be? What don't you want it to be? We're not very good at saying this stuff out loud. We kind of intimate it. We hope that they pick up on it. We try and say things and say, you get where I'm coming from. Well, guess what? No one actually gets where you're coming from unless you've got deep trust with them and they know you very well. Even then, it can be up for grabs. So I'll give you some examples of an intention statement in a moment. Something that I utilize very, very often when I'm working with clients who, let's face it, I often have to have tough conversations. Perhaps a leader isn't pulling their weight or they're causing some difficulties with their teams. I'll use what's called self-disclosure. And this is where if I want someone to be vulnerable, I'll be vulnerable first. How have I been thinking and feeling about this conversation in advance of having it? This helps build trust. If I can say, look, I've been a bit nervous about having this conversation with you. These sorts of declarations help people humanize you, and it might give them a sense to say, oh, well, I don't want to create that. Remember, most people are good. Right? Very rarely are you dealing with narcissists and psychopaths. By the way, none of these skills work on narcissists and psychopaths, but the majority of people are good. The majority of people, if given an inch of respect and trust, will repay in kind. It's called the law of reciprocity. I'll give you an example in a moment. Request is also a powerful tool. What do you need to feel safe? Don't be afraid of asking for it, because funnily enough, people like to grant requests. And so if you can ask what you need as you're setting up a conversation, you might find that they've got a request too. And a key behavior in your framing is wait till you've got a yes before you advance a conversation. So let me give you an example about utilizing some of these framing tools in an opening statement. I'm not going to use them all, but in example one, let's have a look at it. I might say, hey, I need to have a potentially challenging conversation with you. And look, it's about how we're working together. Are you happy to talk? I've got to get that yes. Thank you. Look, what I'm hoping is that we can agree to a better way of making decisions about key deliverables. I'm not coming from a place of wanting to cause an argument here. I do want to have a frank conversation with you about some things that you are doing that I'm struggling with. but I don't want you to think that I'm not open to feedback myself. Ultimately, I want what's best for project. Are you happy to proceed? Now, that was about 20 seconds of dialogue. In a good conversation, you might be there for 30 minutes unpacking issues. But if you can pay attention to that opening, what Susan Scott calls stump speech, you're going to get this person's brain paying attention. You're already planting seeds to say that you have a proactive, pro-social, positive intention for this conversation, but that you're not going to be wishy-washy. You do have something to say. You're building candor and you're building vulnerability. So you notice I haven't used all of the framing tools here, but this might be an example of earning permission to go forward. The second example could be to say, oh, look, the purpose of this conversation is to, again, raise with you some concerns I'm having about person Y in your team. Look, to be frank, I'm a little apprehensive about talking about this with you because last time we had a conversation about them, you and I ended up in an argument. So I need you to know I'm not raising this with you because I'm wanting to cause trouble for the sake of it. This isn't about politics. I really want to work this out with you. So can I ask that you hear me out here? And I'll do the same for you. Are you happy to talk? I've found that with powerful frames, you get people sitting up, respecting you for taking the time to think about them, to set these conversations up well, and you are more likely to commence a conversation with two people operating from a rational part of their brain. So let's just get some tips, some ideas continuing here. Prepare in your mind your message with the other person's brain in mind. What needs to be said to allay any potential fight or flight responses that might occur? And how can I position this message so that it will actually be heard? If you take the time, if you plan it out, you're more likely to say it. Some of you might be thinking, well, I sound a bit insincere. Well, the more you put it in your own words, some of these frames and these tools here are my language for this example here today, but you'll find your own idiosyncratic or linguistic way into these tools. So let's get into the actual message itself. Okay, so I just want to, you've earned your entree into the conversation, you've framed it up. What do you want to say? Well, one of the best things is, again, come back to our duck rabbit, is to remember that potentially you're coming from a place of, these are hunches. Maybe they're just feelings. They're nascent feelings. Maybe it's not something that is so absolutely unequivocal. A useful thing to do is don't state them as fact, but actually share them tentatively and then ask for their input with an open question. So let me give you an example. Rather than saying, oh, look, you never like having a feedback conversation, I'm going to use tentative language like, I get the sense. So I get the sense and I could be wrong are two really useful phrases. So have a look at this one. Look, I get the sense that when we have a feedback conversation, you'd rather not be in the room, but I could be wrong. What are your thoughts? Do you see how this is gentler, but it also is naming the issue? So we're not jumping away or shying away from it, but you're also placing out there, but I could be wrong. What are your thoughts? Now, you'll notice that's an open question. It's not a closed question like, do you think that's true or is that the case? But what are your thoughts? Get them talking. The moment you've named something, invite a conversation. And who knows, maybe that'll be enough to address the situation. A useful tip is also, where you can, take accountability. If it's something that you could have done earlier, you maybe let them know you probably could have checked in with them earlier, that you could have followed up, that you were less concerned at the time when you're thinking back on previous behaviour. So you might just want to say, look, I just want to admit openly that I feel I have some accountability in this situation. I should have raised this with you much earlier. By not doing so, I probably haven't given you the chance to address this issue when it was of minor consequence. If you can take accountability, this builds goodwill. They're not sitting there thinking that they're the bad guy, you're the good guy, right? It's such a powerful gesture for the relationship when you can take accountability. Now, I'm obviously not saying make up accountability if it's not there, but if there is a way that you can offer this, the law of reciprocity is if you give, you're more likely to get. But, let's also tackle this idea that we do make judgments. We make these quick judgments. It's a duck, it's a rabbit. It can be really useful in your planning to go, well, what is objectively true here? If you look at this, it's a sketch. It's black lines and white lines on a little bit of paper that's been turned into a slide and projected via the internet to your eyes. That's the fact of this picture. Well, similarly, when we're thinking about, things we might want to talk to our colleagues about, be aware that we go to opinions and viewpoints first. Duck, you're not a team player. Rabbit, you've got poor work ethic. Duck, you're lazy. Rabbit, unskilled, bad attitude. Instead, let's just sort of step back and go, well, what's visible? What are the actual observables that led to this? What are the examples? So if I were to talk to someone and say they're not a team player, if I asked each one of you here on this call what that meant to you, you'd probably have your own version of behaviours that equaled not a team player. For me, it's, well, you didn't participate in the team meeting, you held on to information relevant to a peer, and you didn't help during a peak period when asked. So what we need to do is separate what's a fact and what's a viewpoint. A really useful model for putting this all together is something called the SBI model. This was designed by the Centre for Creative Leadership. It's their intellectual property. But what the SBI model is, a really useful planning tool to say, all right, I'm going to get my cards on the table here. This was the situation. This was the behaviour that I saw. And this is the impact that it had on me. It's a great planning tool because what you're doing is you're starting as objectively as you can. Right? You're not leading with judgmental language, which will lead to resistance. You're talking about stuff that most people are probably going to agree on. And if you can do this dispassionately with an open heart, you're more likely to get to where you want to get to. Now, with the impact statement, it's really important that you recognize that impact statements can be both objective and subjective. So there could be objective impacts of someone's behavior, but you are allowed to own your view on someone's behavior. The important thing is if you're going to be subjective, be explicitly subjective. So use language like, well, I felt or I perceived. In my opinion, I felt like this meant that you weren't wanting to be part of the team. They can't argue with your subjectivity. And the good news is you're not laying it down as a fact. You're just sharing your perspective. Now, if you're going to use SBI, plan it out. Don't be afraid to even have it next to you as you're having the conversation. Show someone that you care by saying, look, I've made some notes to help me get through this conversation. I'm not very good at them. All of these things declare a bit of vulnerability and build trust. But once you've given your SBI, the important thing is here, you've got to get them talking. You've got to ask them a few questions. Well, what's your view? What are your thoughts here? Make it a conversation. This is not curious. Do you agree that happened? That's not curious. What's your take on what I'm saying? That's one of my favorite questions. What's your take on what I'm saying? Get them talking. Now, the idea is you've got to demonstrate your listening. If you want to be understood by the other party, demonstrate that you understand them too. If you want to go even to a more nuanced perspective here, then think about getting an agreement. Look, if this is going to happen again, let's get agreement on what we want to see into the future. And if that happens, this is the desired result of our conversation. This really sets it up as being a constructive conversation, and we can use this in formal feedback, but we can use it in our just workplace relationships as well. Remember, this is the right outcome we want. When I said earlier, don't try to be right, just get the right outcome. This is what we're aiming for here. We could go back and forth and say, no, you really meant that, or no, you didn't, you knew that. Instead, okay, if this situation were to happen again, what will we do? Get agreement on that. It builds trust. So again, I just recommend you use that SBI model. It's a great way of structuring your conversation. 70% of it is in those speech bubbles there. It's in the curiosity. And at the end of the conversation, I cannot underline this enough. Check in for the relationship. In other words, summarize what you've covered, check that you're accurate. Are we leaving with the same understanding? But then check in with them. What's the impact had on your relationship? Look, I know that might have been a tough conversation. How are we going? Are we okay? How's this conversation landed on you? End on a note whereby you're essentially being generous and letting them know that you care about how this conversation's landed. I always find it useful to say, look, we've just been through that. Is there anything left unsaid? Is there anything else that needs to be said? Is there anything on your mind that you want to share here? Because sometimes other stuff might start to bubble up, and boy, oh boy, doesn't that tell you that you are developing a more trusting relationship when you're getting into deeper territory here? So, if you create that space, that is going to be very much a valued gesture at the end. And of course, thank them for their time and openness. So my last little tip here before I open up to some Q&A is to concentrate on behavioural language not subjective language. So make sure that you're using that behavioral language. What I observed, this is what I saw, this is what happened. And if you must offer subjective views, do so after the behavioral language, but own them as being subjective. This is what I felt. This is what I saw. Make it a conversation. Be curious. And folks, listen, 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 listen. There's a phrase that a colleague of mine uses, which is listen like your life depends on it. We're just such bad listeners. We often get caught up in our own head. We're thinking about what we're going to say, or we're worried about this or worried about that. Put everything to the side. Pay attention. Just the act of listening tends to go a long way in resolving conflict. And lastly, end with the relationship in mind. Check for the impact that it's had. Check in for anything less unsaid and express gratitude. So I've just been on a long and winding road going through some key ideas here. First of all, we've talked about making sure that you get yourself in the right mindset. That's a really, really critical component of this. Okay. I need to lean in. I need to have the conversation. I've got to have courage. I need to role model my values. I need to have the conversation. I need to not be saying to myself, I own the truth of this matter. Rather, I need to go in there with a curiosity to find out what might be driving it, because it's likely there's a decent human being over there that has a whole different story. I then need to think about their brains, and I need to think about my brains. I don't want to be in fight or flight mode. I don't want to be operating out of reactivity. Get your emotional state right. It will have a palpable influence on yourself and the other party in the conversation. And then think about their brains all throughout. How can I frame up this conversation? If I want them to take a risk by being open and vulnerable with me, what can I say to allay their fears right at the get-go? Then, how do I prepare my message? Use behavioral language. Own your subjectivity and ask tons of questions and listen, and close out your conversations with a gesture towards the relationship. Really let them know you care, let them know you're grateful, and create space for anything else. And you know what? It's even better if you follow up the next day and still check in again. What happens is the more we do this, the better we get at it, the more easier the next conversation gets with that person or with others, and we start to role model the kind of leadership that we want to create. So I am going to be aware that many of you are either going to duck back into lunch or you want to grab a sandwich. What questions does anyone have at this stage? I'd love to open it up to the floor if we've got time, Asmita.
Sorry, I'm on mute. No, we do have a few more minutes. So if anyone's got questions, please do unmute yourself and jump in while we've got time with Simon. Should utilize it as best we can. Cool.
Oh, I got a hand up here.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, Simon.
Hello.
Yes.
How are you, Joe?
I'm good. Yes, and thank you for your presentation. Really good topics, and I think that you need to be in a good position mentally to be able to approach it that way. My question to you is, how do you change your message, or do you change it at all when you have to give that? When you need to have that difficult conversation to the top, to the one that you report to, or to the ones that report to you?
Yeah. So when we think where this most matters is in the framing. So if I think about the framing tool here, and let me just get my presentation back up. Okay. One of the things that many people say to me is ask is this very question, and I'm going to start off by being a little bit, I suppose, controversial, well, not controversial, challenging to say, if you were a leader, would you be open to someone having a conversation with you? Well, most people would say absolutely. But one thing they would want is they would want that person, if it was a direct report coming up the way, is not to presume that they own the full truth. So when I'm talking about managing upwards, and I've used these framing tools very much in these examples, think about things like the position statement. So it'd be something like, hey, Madam Boss, look, I need to have potentially a bit of a tricky conversation with you. Do you have the bandwidth to have this? That's a really respectful thing to say. And then self-disclosure. Look, I've been a bit nervous about having this conversation. You are my boss, and I don't want to put a foot wrong. Now, you might even think that's a little bit manipulative, but it's actually a very powerful thing to say, because it puts the onus on the leader to actually be a leader and go, well, I need to create space here. You're also being vulnerable. And as I say, that's a really important gesture. But lastly, your intention statement. Look, I'm going to put forward a difficult bit of feedback to you, I need you to know my intention here is because I want to have an open, transparent relationship with you. I'm not suggesting I own the full truth. You've got a better field of vision than me about what's going on in this business right now. Yet, out of my values and out of what I hope are your values, I feel the need to raise this issue with you. That's an example of utilizing the framing tools for upward management. Now, I've coached plenty of people to use those framing tools in that way, and to great effect. So you tailor the position and topic and permission, you tailor the self-disclosure, and you tailor the intention statement. Everything else remains the same as long as you are demonstrating that you're listening. Now, I'm trying to keep that a concise answer, but is that useful to you?
Yes, it is. It is very useful. Thank you, Simon.
And another thing to say is forging contracts with people. So sometimes it might be useful at the outset of a relationship, and again, is to say, look, are you the kind of leader that welcomes feedback? Because, I want to be able to, give you my thoughts. I want to be able to operate with as much transparency with you as possible. If I did have to raise a difficult issue with you, how would you like to receive it? So sometimes addressing feedback before there's an actual issue to have feedback on can be a really powerful thing to do as well.
Yeah, thank you, Simon.
Oh, great pleasure. Great question. Connor.
Hey, how you going, Simon? Really good to join the conversation. Really appreciate everything you've said. I think you have done true to what you said and speak very fast. You've had me typing very fast as well.
Well, we'll be posting this on YouTube afterwards, so there'll be a chance to go back and press pause. So there you go.
And watch on slow motion.
I'm sorry, there's a lot to get through.
No, I appreciate it. I had a question. There's a person in my life I give constructive feedback to, and they start the conversation quite open-minded, but they get overwhelmed and stay quite silent. So I'll find there's not much dialogue back and forward, and I'll end up contributing to the conversation and adding more and adding more and adding more, and it can be quite stressful for them. And then there can be a breaking point, and then the conversation's clearly over, and both kind of walk away without much construction since the last time. And you may have that conversation multiple times to see the issues addressed. I was wondering how you can get around overwhelming someone, and how you can say. Yeah, sure.
No. So a couple of things to say is we've got to be really mindful of how much talking we're doing. And if we get nervous and we overload it, it does become overwhelming. And some people withdraw, as you've identified. So there's a couple of things I want to say. First of all, in the conversation itself, it can be really useful to name the dynamic that you're saying and to say, look, I'm aware that I've just gone on for a long period of time and you've actually started to say very little. And my interpretation of that is that I'm overwhelming you. I need to restate my intention here that I wanted this to be an open conversation. So I'm going to zip it. What's going on for you right now? So in other words, don't ignore the dynamic, name it. It's a really powerful tool to create psychological safety. The second thing I'd say is if this is a pattern with this individual, have a feedback conversation with them about how they receive feedback. So put aside all the stuff you're giving them feedback about for a moment and actually say, look, I noticed that this tends to be the pattern when we have feedback conversations. We'll begin, it starts to go well, and then after a while, I sense that you closed down. I could be wrong, but it's looking like you're getting overwhelmed. What's your thoughts on that? So in other words, outside of any kind of moment, actually talk about the feedback itself. Now, the third thing I'd say is if you're giving multiple feedback to someone about something, that's when you need to say, hey, look, there's a pattern here. What do we need to do to make it easier for you to take on board feedback? And I suspect they're somewhat linked. They need to do some reflection about their ownership of what they play within the conversation, but they also probably need to hear from them about the volume that you're speaking and say, well, what's going to be a better way for us to do this feedback caper between us? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Mini contracts, name the dynamic in the conversation and address the pattern.
Sure.
Great question. Hope that's useful, Connor.
Oh, always. Yes. Everything you said has been very useful.
Okay. Any final questions, good people?
No.
All right. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you. I'm going to put up a slide here. How about I do that properly? Is this the slide, Asmita, you wanted to talk to at the end there, or was it this one?
That's all right. It's just, yeah, just this one, just to say that we'll be popping the recording up on YouTube channel, and I'll also post the link into the LinkedIn group as well. So keep an eye out for it, because I know that this is a topic that I myself will probably come back and revisit, especially right before having to have a difficult conversation. It's just a good refresher. So I will share that around, and hopefully you know, we can all get better at it and not feel as anxious. Should be good. And lastly, I'd just really like to say thank you so much for your time, Simon. I know that you can be quite busy and have a lot of clients and things on, and you know, being able to volunteer your time for us like this, it's invaluable. So thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks to you, Asmita, for having me on board, and thanks to everyone. Have a great rest of day.